Good evening. I'm Ann Gordon Curran, and I am a volunteer, professional volunteer at the Bowen Center. And I schedule these meetings for your pleasure and to explore Bowen theory more thoroughly. Give people a little extra time to present ideas if they present on this Thursday evening. Let me introduce to you our director for the Bowen Center, and that's Ms. Carrie Collier, Dr. Collier, excuse me. And she has a few words to say.
Welcome to all of the new people, and also welcome back to people that join these and join our other conferences and our programs. This is just a really wonderful opportunity, and I think Dr. Papero has offered a great title for this evening, which is bringing people from all over. I just want to welcome people to come back and look at the website. We have our spring conference coming up on the family emotional history. And we have opened up our new introductory program online, and there are a few seats left. And we also have a new program led by Kathy Wiseman, a faculty at the Bowen Center, titled Differentiation at Work, which is geared towards the more advanced Bowen theory learner who's been around the block a few times. There will be an email sent to your email that you used to register for this conference with this information on these three offerings if you want to register or apply to one of the programs. So I just welcome you to look at your email after the conference, and I'm going to turn it back over to Ann Curran. Thank you very much.
This evening we have Dr. Papero. Dr. Papero has presented at this professional lecture series a number of times over the years. He achieved his graduate training in social work at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, and then entered the postgraduate training in family systems theory and psychotherapy at the Georgetown University Family Center. In 1982, Dr. Murray Bowen invited him to join the faculty at the center. He has served in many capacities at the now Bowen Center for the Study of the Family. He is often a principal speaker at the annual symposium, spring conference, and serving on panels as well, and does a clinical conference annually. He presents extensively across the country and beyond in such places as Hong Kong and Australia. In 1990, he published a book called The Bowen Family Systems Theory, a basic introduction to family systems ideas. And in 2015, with Dr. Robert J. Noon, he edited a book called The Family Emotional System, an integrative concept for theory, science, and practice. Tonight, he will be describing how the extended human family appears to act as a buffer for its members and the interconnected nuclear families. I've messed up my notes. Excuse me. Nuclear families that comprise it during such times. For that buffering to occur, family members and family subunits have to remain in viable and meaningful contact with one another, just as emotional forces within the extended family press individuals to remain connected. Other forces work against those connections and lead to the cutoff of relationships in the short and long term. Let's welcome Dr. Papero as he presents the value of connection to survival, differentiation, cutoff, and the family system in troubled times.
Thank you, Ms. Curran. Again, it's a pleasure to be here. I hope I haven't overpromised for this evening. It's a big topic, and it's one I thought about for many, many years. In a certain sense, I'm reporting the obvious. I'm going to share my screen here and get that part of it going. Excuse me just a moment while I get this going. The basic idea that the family is extraordinarily important for individual adaptation and adaptation of the family system to conditions faced is obvious on the surface of it. And whether one's thought about it or not, I think all humans know instinctively that the family system is important. So that in a certain sense, there's nothing I have to say tonight that you don't already know. Probably many of you know it better than I do, but I'm going to review it with you. The past 10 months, as the world has wrestled with the pandemic and the consequences of the various adaptive responses of communities and families and governmental units, it's been a wonderful time to observe family system functioning. It's been extraordinarily helpful to me to watch the response of family units, including my own, as the ups and downs of COVID and the various sorts of things have affected how people function, have challenged the unit, and have led to pressures to adapt, respond, and even to survive. The proposition that I'm going to lay out tonight is a fairly simple one, that the human family system evolved to facilitate the survival and reproduction of individual family members, but also of the unit itself. And in times of challenge, the family system can do a number of things. One of the most important is that when it is functioning well, it can expand the network for the collection of information, and through the linked human brains create a massive parallel processing system of information about the internal condition of the family system, the nature of objective reality, that is what the family is up against, and the arsenal, if you will, of response processes that the family has, individuals have, and also the options available at any given moment in time. And that this family system can support the survival of individual family members and of parts of the larger family system that are more heavily impacted by events. And it can assist the movement of the family and family members from unfavorable to favorable living environments, a phenomenon that's existed as long as families have existed. Finally, that family systems vary in their resiliency and in their ability to recover from the effects of major challenge. There are probably a host of variables that go into affecting resiliency and the ability of a family system to recover from a major challenge. A significant one from my point of view is differentiation of self, the degree of maturity individually and collectively within the family system. But there are a number of others. The family history plays a role. The nature of the conditions faced plays a role. The resources available to the family unit at any point in time play a role. So there are many factors that go into this variability in the family's ability to adapt to challenge. And I'll review a little bit of that as we go on this evening. As I start, I want to just review Murray Bowen's terminology. He uses the term nuclear family to include the father, mother, and children of the present and future generations. And then the extended family refers to the entire network of living relatives. He goes on to say usually it refers to grandparents, parents, and children. And then he adds the emotional field. It describes the emotional process in any area being considered. That's from his writings. Then in a personal communication in a meeting many, many years ago, when asked to define family, Dr. Bowen came up with the definition of family you see at the bottom of the slide, the total number of organisms attached to an emotional nucleus. Both of these are important definitions, and I just put them out here so that I can keep them in mind as we go through this rather brief talk this evening. So what Bowen is describing here is something that looks roughly like this. A family unit, a nuclear family unit, circled here in red, that's connected to other nuclei, if you will, that represent its extended family system. It's connected to some with very intense bonds, to others with less. There's closeness, there's distance. If I tried to really do the network of connections, it would be much more complicated than this, because every individual and every one of those family units has the potential to connect to every other individual within it. But what you can see here is something that resembles almost a spider web, with that nuclear family being held in a certain sense in place by its connections to others, and its stability through that network is to some degree assured. So I want to look at the family system. Is it in fact a bridge over troubled waters? Families have been around from time immemorial, at least as long as the hominid species have been a part of our evolutionary history. It appears that for the human, our families began as large networks of extended kin, often up to about 150 individuals. Within that larger group, this larger multi-generational group, were various reproductive pairs, breeding pairs, if you will, of reproductive age males and females, not necessarily forming nuclear families in the way that we think about it today, but surrounded by both offspring and relatives, again, in this network of up to about 150 individuals. Often within this network, resources were distributed and shared, and alloparenting occurred. That is, many people became responsible to assist the actual biological parent, usually the mother, or the parents in the raising of young. The nuclear family concept, as we understand it today, is a relatively recent concept. It's actually taken its position as what we generally mean by family when we talk about it in a conventional sense in the modern world. It came to be dominant in the early 20th century as a result of the work of a number of sociologists who focused on this as the important element of family. So I want to keep in mind that for the human, the idea of nuclear family has been always embedded in this larger network of kin, and that this isolating out of the nuclear family or separating out of the nuclear family is a relatively recent phenomenon. Underlying the functioning of human families are basic, from my point of view, biological instincts. These things form the basis and shape the culture of societies. In a general sense, families are interested in the welfare of themselves, of the family members, and particularly of children. And that welfare includes the basic things one thinks about: food, shelter, and safety, health, and emotional well-being. As we've gone through the last year or so of challenge and difficulty, one hears these things being echoed over and over and over again in people's concerns and in the concerns of the media and in the manipulations of the politicians seeking to gain advantage in a period of turbulence. Another major underlying interest of human families is to procure resources and to use them well. Resources represent a number of things. Certainly relationships form a very significant resource for the human family and for the human family system. Whatever support can be provided, information. Resources can also involve tangible property, things that you can hold in your hand, things that you can transfer. But another very important resource that human families and individuals within human families think about a lot is social positioning. On the one hand, there's a concern about losing social position, but on the other, there's the opportunity for improving social position. Certainly the concern about losing social position has been echoed in a lot of the fearfulness around the world as groups react to one another. There's been less focus in the last year on the possibility of improving social position, but that's always there as well. And finally, in a general sense, families are interested in a pathway to the future for their offspring, for their children. In a modern world, that represents some form of education, some form of gainful employment, the ability for those children to develop and collect resources of their own to support future reproduction. I consider these things absolutely fundamental in human families, and one hears them and sees them in many, many, many arenas of life. Many of you have known, have heard me talk about the basic functions of the human family system. This is my effort to understand the basic function that led to the evolution of families. What functions did families evolve to serve in another way? This is in essence Tinbergen's question one of the 4 questions that Tinbergen proposed in his 1963 article on ethology. On the one hand, a primary function of the human family system is an economic function, which I am defining as the function of extracting resources from the environment that sustain life and well-being. A second primary function is a regenerative or growth function, that is to create a context for reproduction and for the development of succeeding generations. I consider these 2 primary functions of the human family. There are 2 secondary functions, which can be described as maintaining and protecting functions in response to environmental challenge. The maintenance function, the maintaining function, has to do with maintaining the connections between people within the family system and beyond that to the larger environment, and maintaining the processes of adapting to internal and external changes. How well does the family adapt? What is its arsenal of adaptive processes? And then the related function is that of protecting, to assess danger and protect when the family unit or elements of that unit are threatened. In order to do that, to perform those functions, the family has to remain in emotional contact with one another. The relationships have to exist and be functional. Bowen, let me go back for just a moment to the, well, it won't go back. Here we go. I want to just comment for a moment on the background to the slide. This is, of course, the very famous Michelangelo painting of the Sistine Chapel with God extending his hand to Moses. And as you'll see, if you look very carefully, the fingers don't quite touch. It's a remarkable, in my view, depiction of the human relationship process, reaching and not quite touching. In his writings, Bowen uses 2 terms to refer to contact in the human family. He uses the term meaningful emotional contact, and he uses the term viable emotional contact. I consider these related but somewhat different terms, and you may understand them differently from me, but this is how I've tried to put it together. Meaningful contact involves a number of things. From the Oxford English Dictionary, the word meaningful actually says something that is serious, important, or worthwhile. So meaningful contact has to do with something that's important or potentially worthwhile. The way I would think about it, meaningful contact is contact between people within a family system that has an influence or an effect on the participants. That is, it has consequences, it's consequential. It may affect the provision of resources. It may affect and shift the emotional tone within an individual and or within the relationship system itself. It has the potential to alter and modify the perceptual field, both of individual participants and of the family perceptual field itself. and it has the capacity to induce reactive behavior. There are probably other aspects that one could call meaningful contact, but those are some of the ones I've thought about. And the feeling tone of meaningful contact can be comfortable or uncomfortable. And that contact, that meaningful contact, can shift the unfolding interpersonal patterns of reactivity within the system itself. Viable emotional contact, I think, has a somewhat different meaning. Viable has a number of definitions. I, again, drew from the Oxford English Dictionary the section in which they defined the term viable as it's used in biology. And it's used to describe the capacity of a living thing to survive or live successfully, especially under environmental conditions. So it's a somewhat different meaning. It has more to do in a certain sense with a degree of hardiness or capability or whatever. And contact, of course, has a number of meanings. It can be physical touching. It can be a connection for the passage of a current of some kind, an act of communicating. So that viable contact has within it this sort of hardiness, this resilience of being able to remain connected, to remain touching, to remain in communication, if you will, under all kinds of environmental conditions. In trying to think about this and represent it graphically, I came up with something like this. I hope it will be helpful to your visualizing of this. Perhaps it won't. If I were to outline a continuum of emotional contact that can exist between members of a family, at one end, on the right side here, would be very, very good emotional contact reflected in a degree of person-to-person relatability between the members of the family. At the other end of the continuum would be the complete cutoff or separation or the absence of active contact between members of the family. In this middle range between the two bars, we have something that represents some sort of contact, perhaps more ritualistic or formal. In the middle ranges, perhaps more coordination, moving more toward the person-to-person, and so on. Meaningful contact, from my point of view, could span this entire range of contact and connectedness. Viable contact, however, I think, I don't know exactly where to start the beginning of that line, that green line representing viable contact, but it is somewhere at the upper end of this rather than reaching all the way down. If I were to juxtapose that continuum against one called emotional attachment, then the viable contact would reflect a more resolved state of emotional contact between members of the family, and the cutoff would represent a more unresolved degree of emotional attachment between members of the family. And if I were to put a continuum of differentiation of self up there, then the more mature end of the continuum, the end representing differentiation, would line up with viable contact and resolved emotional attachment, and that the other end would line up, the undifferentiated end would line up with the unresolved and distant contact in the family. I think one has to be clear that viable contact is somewhat different from feeling close. People and families want to feel close. It's a natural human thing to do. All of us like to feel close, but viable contact, I think, suggests something somewhat different from that. And in this following slide, I've tried to contrast these to be a little bit clearer about what I think the difference is between the two. Yeah, I've lost my cursor, and now I can't get my slides to change. All right, what am I going to do here? Oh, the joys of there we go. Okay, found it. So feeling close has within it feeling comfortable. People like to feel comfortable, want to feel comfortable when relating to others. Generally, feeling close involves the exchange of warm, positive feelings between people. This may or may not reflect what Bowen calls emotional fusion. Often within a feeling close phenomenon, communication is relatively easy. Often the viewpoints are shared, not necessarily in contrast to one another. Viable contact is somewhat different. It may or may not feel good. In fact, viable contact and the effort to maintain viable contact may be downright uncomfortable. Often it's accompanied by ambivalent feelings, including for the person working on it, the internal pressure to get away from others that then he or she has to come to terms with. Open communication becomes more effortful. It requires more thought. It requires more self-management and so on. And in fact, that may have to be done in the face of significant disapproval from important others. And it may require the management of intense emotional reactivity in oneself in order to remain in the arena of viable contact. There are a number of benefits to contact and connection within the human family system. You all know what they are, and this is just a partial list. We could add many more probably if we talked about it. Certainly, there's access to the resources, the collective resources of the group. These again include tangible resources. They include support resources, but they also are intangible and can include a way of operating a structure which helps people manage the effects of stress. Again, support, information, and knowledge. Other intangible resources can be something that we loosely define as companionship, various sorts of deferent structures which allow people to function within particular roles. Leadership is another intangible resource that emerges in families. And of course, developed routines and processes for problem solving are another set of resources that come from contact and connection. In addition, anxiety, stress, and fear management can be a benefit of contact. But the other can also be true. Connection can also promote the intensification of anxiety and fear if it's not managed well. Part of the ability to manage fear has to do with within the network of mature family members who have an ability to manage themselves under high stress, high pressure situations, and their stability helps others with the management of anxiety and fearfulness. There's also this phenomenon we call wisdom that is a benefit of contact, that somewhere in the system people have been here before or done that, have some knowledge about how to do it, have some idea of what's happening, this sort of thing. In addition to this, there is an emotional strength within families that can be tapped through contact. And finally, there's the value of a family history of effective adaptation with minimal impairment of anyone in the system that becomes, in a sense, a resource of value of connection as the family faces and individuals face challenge in an ongoing way. Finally, mutual defense is, of course, a value, a benefit that comes from contact with the larger family system. However, contact and connection in the larger family system brings with it the potential for costs and for difficult things to manage. If nothing else, within the family system, contact brings with it rules and expectations and pressures for conformity that regulate membership within the group itself, within the family unit. It's part of what forms the unseen boundary between an insider and an outsider, and these sorts of things. There's also constraints on individuality and individual goals that can occur and create a potential challenge to an individual working on maintaining contact and being in connection with the family system. The system can put demands. Sometimes these demands are based in reality, sometimes they're imagined, for access to an individual's life energy and how that life energy is used, setting up the conflict inside the individual between how much do I make myself available to my family and how much do I retain my life energy, whatever that is, for myself and for my goals. In addition to that, within the family system, there's exposure to interpersonal stress and emotionally driven behavior and patterns involving self and others, and these can be quite extreme at times. They can include violence, abuse, and various forms of one individual exploiting or taking advantage of others. Excuse me. Oh, here we go. There we go. Before passing on to my next section, I do want to point out Bowen's actual writing on what he says about the value of contact with that larger family system. Again, he talks about when a nuclear family is able to maintain, and here he uses the term viable emotional contact with past generations, the more orderly and asymptomatic the life process is in both generations. So this is beneficial both ways. There's something about this contact that appears to lead to a more orderly and a more asymptomatic life process, the process of living life itself in both generations. He goes on to say that one of the benefits that comes out of this connection for the nuclear family is that if one or both parents can reestablish emotional contact with their families, the level of anxiety subsides, so that anxiety decreases with contact. That is the first time I ever heard Maury Bowen. That is what stuck in my mind, that if I would work on my contact with my family, the family I came from, the anxiety level might subside in the family that I currently lived in. Then he goes on to suggest in another part of this quotation, the more the nuclear family is cut off from those families, the families from which they came, the higher the incidence of problems and symptoms. So this idea of contact and connection, according to Bowen, plays a major role in the orderliness of life processes, the degree of anxiety within the entire family system, but also within that nuclear family unit, and the incidence of problems and symptoms encountered. So, family units facing difficult conditions are put under pressure. And the question is, do they have within them an adaptive flexibility, or does the family system become rigid and or chaotic, both of which can lead to a breakdown in the efficient and effective functioning of the family unit? This is a quotation from Dr. Bowen where he makes the point. Again, I've highlighted the salient points in red. He talks about a range of adaptive patterns in the nuclear family, and he suggests that as emotional tension increases, stress and anxiety, the adaptive patterns lose their flexibility and symptoms erupt. The loss of flexibility is part of what happens as leading to the emergence of symptoms as families face challenge and as stress and tension increase. Again, a quotation from Bowen reflecting the importance of differentiation of self to adaptive flexibility. Again, he's suggesting that those individuals who have the greatest ability to know the difference within themselves between that which is more feelingful, more automatic, more emotional, and that which is more thoughtful, and he adds, or who have the most differentiation of self, have the most flexibility and adaptability in coping with life stresses. And here he goes on to say, the most freedom from problems of any kind. What follows now is my inference of why differentiation of self matters to the family unit. It's laid out in a sort of an argument form or an if-then formulation, if you'll allow that, so that the more pronounced the undifferentiation is within a family system, the more sensitive that unit is to threats to the family unity, and therefore to more stress. A family unit that has a lot of undifferentiation, a lot of what Bowen called a psychological oneness, an undifferentiated family ego mass, if you want that term. The more sensitive that unit is to challenge, and the more stress it is likely to carry as a result. That within that intensely clumped unit of undifferentiation, small movements toward individuality produce tremendous togetherness-oriented reactions. That high togetherness families with a high level of undifferentiation should therefore display more inherent turbulence as emotional reactiveness fuels relationships, creating more stressed family members. And families high on togetherness with low levels of differentiation should display limited flexibility, intensified rigidity of response when stressed, and a kind of semi-permanent freeze in response to the world. Continuing that line of reasoning, family systems displaying less intense togetherness, that is a greater degree of differentiation of self, will permit greater emotional autonomy and behavioral freedom for family members. And that equates to less hassle, less stress in the system, and less stress individually. Family systems with less togetherness should present more orderly family processes, and family systems with less togetherness or more differentiation should show greater flexibility in responding to stress-inducing challenge. Now, I shift here to a kind of a summary of much of the psychological literature out there. That increasing anxiety and emotional tension reduces flexibility in the functioning of individuals, and this reduction in the flexibility leads to an increasing inefficient and ineffective adaptive process. In the literature, one hears generally about cognitive inflexibility, emotional inflexibility, and behavioral inflexibility as things that reflect this constraining of the flexible response of the individual to challenge. And these things result in a narrowing and distorting of the perceptual field of the individual in context and time. What I mean by that is the range of perception narrows and time frames are altered. This can result in delusional causal associations, confirmation biases, and the loss of long-term perspectives, and a narrowing of perception of context, which reduces awareness of options for behavior. So kind of a long-winded way of trying to say what inflexibility, what the effects of it are on an individual. Just to define the terms, cognitive flexibility has to do with the capacity to shift the cognitive processes in one's brain to adjust to changing demands, priorities, and perspectives. This one comes from the Center on the Developing Child. Emotional flexibility I've defined or thought about as, on the one hand, the ability to modulate the intensity or the strength of the emotion, and then also the ability to modulate the valence or feeling tone of the emotion. Then from the psychological research literature, we come up with the idea of emotion regulation flexibility. This isn't something that Bowen talks about per se, but it does come out of the psychological literature, and it refers to the ability of an individual to shift the strategies by which he or she is attempting to regulate emotion. And the three general ways that you find in the literature of strategies of emotion regulation have to do with cognitive reappraisal. This is a sort of famous reframing that all therapists love to think about. Then there has to do with the self-soothing versus self-confrontation. This has to do with the the general outlook mindset of the individual, and finally, the individual's ability to control his or her own attentional focus. The attentional focus may in fact be the key element in emotion regulation flexibility. The ability to regulate focal attention seems to be critical in the management of emotion and emotional reactivity. These three things together, emotion regulation flexibility, emotional flexibility, and cognitive flexibility, combine to create behavioral flexibility. Again, defining that as the ability to regulate and shift behavior to facilitate goal attainment. This is, I would argue, one of the key elements of differentiation of self. So much for the flexibility of the individual, but what about the flexibility of the family system itself? What about resiliency and recovery? To use the ship metaphor, it's great when the ship is sailing through sunny seas, but the ability to re-rig the ship, to get its bow into the waves, becomes an important element in the ship's ability to survive in stormy conditions, and something similar to that probably occurs in the human family system. There are some basic fundamentals that I think are part of family system flexibility. These are 6. You may have others that you've thought about. Number 1, that the key family members are in good contact. Who are the key family members? Well, if you thought about your family, you could probably come up with them. They're the people who have the good contact. They're the people who know what's going on in the family. They're the ones that others look to in one way or another. There are a number of ways to think about key family members, but in a flexible human family system, those key members are in relatively good contact with one another. And that the members of the family, both individually and collectively, are recognizing problems that are reality-based and are active and have ways of engaging problem-solving activities. That within the family system, there's the recognition and active management of emotional tension. That leadership within the family is available and is being produced in an ongoing way. That resources are maintained and well used, and that the family takes responsibility for its decisions. It retains its independence. It retains responsibility for its functioning, and from that position is able to utilize the assistance that can be provided by knowledge, consultants, and so on. There are probably other fundamentals, but these seem to me to be some of the key ones. Another aspect of the flexibility of the family system has to do with the number of person-to-person relationships available within it, that the contact is frequent, that the relationships are open in the sense that information flows freely, both about self, other, that people know what's going on and what self and others are up against, and that this openness and this person-to-person relationship is relatively stable. It is accessible in the swirl of emotional process in the family system. This piece is one that's a newer one for me to think about. It has to do with the function of the family system producing dynamic decisions. That is, decisions that are emerging from the ongoing inflow of information, the processing of that information, and the actions that follow from that. That these decisions are shifting and they're flowing both for the individual and within the collective family system itself. Within the functioning family system, an important element has to do with reconnaissance and information exchange. As I've watched through my consulting practice this year and watching my own family, I've been struck by the reconnaissance function that family members are playing, and then reporting that information back into the broader family system, people are exploring the terrain, they're collecting information, they're looking for resources, they're exchanging that information back into the system about, number one, what are the challenges faced out there? What are the opportunities and what are the resources that are available to deal with the challenge? In addition to that, when the families are functioning relatively well, there's a kind of massive parallel processing of information and response options. As individual brains, each is processing the information and connecting it with others in an interconnected exchange of processing results in an ongoing fashion, allowing information to come in, to be processed, to affect and influence in an ongoing way that keeps a very dynamic adjustment process going. As all of this is going on, as this parallel processing of information and this reconnaissance and information exchange is occurring, action plans are developing, both for an individual and collectively. Within that exchange of information parallel processing, family members are presenting options for behavior. And sometimes there's task distribution, which can either be assigned or simply emerges. And there's a monitoring and a collecting and an attending to the use and resupply of resources. It's been fascinating to listen to families as the COVID vaccine has emerged here in the United States, of how families are mining the information, tracking down the potential possibilities, exchanging that information, making decisions about how to proceed. It's quite remarkable when you think about the dynamism of the family system when it's working well. And finally, there's a continuous, there's a continuous monitoring of the situation, leading to revisions and adjustments in response, leading to other sorts of reconnaissance and processing of information and modifications of action plans and so on in a very dynamic fashion, so that the adaptation is not a slow moving thing. It is a constant flexible adaptation when it's working well. Within all of that, differentiation of self facilitates a number of things. Perhaps most importantly, it permits family members and the collective family system to engage serious challenges head on. It includes the ability to manage emotional reactiveness in oneself and in response to others. It includes the ability to think hard about facts and knowledge, to think through long and short-term consequences of decisions. It allows the ability to work toward establishing and maintaining that viable contact with important others that Bowen describes. It allows the use of that intellectual system to develop projects and plans to address identified challenges. A differentiation of self brings with it a degree of emotional strength, which allows the individual and, to a degree, the collective family unit to remain on course through very difficult situations. And it allows a degree of maintenance of consistency between thought and action, both for individuals and for the family system itself as it moves forward in time. So let's look a little bit at some of the research on family adaptation coming from a line other than Bowen theory. I put this slide up in particular. You may all remember the quote attributed to Murray Bowen is the one he made on the day before he died in an interview. He looked straight into the television camera and said, "People, you have inherited a lifetime of tribulation. Everybody has inherited it. Take it over, make the most of it. And when you have decided you know the right way, do the best you can with it." As time has gone on, I've come to appreciate that sentence more and more, that observation more and more and more. In a sense, it is the essence of differentiation of self. Families appear to vary in their efforts to adapt to change. Some function well before the challenge. They may struggle a bit as the challenge unfolds, but they recover fairly quickly to their degree of competent functioning that they had prior to the challenge. Some may be functioning fairly well prior to the challenge, may take quite a hit, but then gradually resume their pretty good functioning when the challenge is passed. Some function poorly before the challenge, collapse in the aftermath of the challenge, and never recover from that collapse. One of the first to look at all of this was the sociologist Reuben Hill. His 1949 book, Families Under Stress, reviewed in a rather sophisticated way the effects of family unit functioning in response to the crises connected with war separation and reunion in the Midwestern United States. He developed a model he called the ABCX model of family response to challenge, which determined whether the family saw itself in a crisis or whether it sailed through relatively quickly without even seeing the problem as a significant crisis. It had to do with how the family perceived the event A, what resources the family had, the interaction between the resources and the perception led to whether the family operated as if it were a crisis or not. Carrying Hill on, he talks about the degree of family adjustment there are more or less effective degrees of adjustment, adaptation to challenge. He thought that the important elements of a successful adaptation had to do with what he calls role flexibility, plus the ability of the family unit to contain and manage nervous strain and what he calls emotional maladjustment, and in general, whether the family continues to satisfy the needs of its members. So he's looking at whether the family has adapted well or not by how well the various tasks can be redistributed, more flexibly organized in an ongoing way, how much tension and emotional disturbance is accompanying this, and in general, whether the basic needs of family members are continuing to be met. Family adaptability, Hill's research suggested, was reflected in the flexibility, there's that word, and willingness of family members to shift social roles if necessary, the acceptance of responsibility of all family members in performing family tasks, the presence and habits of collective discussion and control, and I've underlined the bottom, a repertoire of crisis meeting devices built out of previous successful experiences with trouble. That is the history of the family response patterns over time. He then talks about adaptation, successful adaptation, reflecting what he calls dynamic stability. It's not something that once attained is always there, but it's constantly being adjusted in a dynamic fashion, good marital adjustment, good family integration. By that, he means the ability of family members to be in contact with one another, and dynamic adjustability of family adaptability. That is, again, another definition of flexibility. "34 years later, another war, Hamilton McCubbin and Joan Patterson conducted another extensive study of families experiencing the stresses of wartime. And they modified Hill's model to create the so-called double ABCX model. You see here over on the left side of the slide, and here the original Hill model. What McCubbin and Patterson and their research suggested is there is this initial response of the family unit to challenge, but that creates follow-on consequences, which then have to be processed in a continuous direction, which they call coping, which then produces over time either an ideal form of adaptation, they call bon adaptation, or maladaptation. So beyond Hill's A, B, and C, McCubbin and Patterson add this idea of the pileup of additional stressors and strains. In other words, each response process, each set of decisions made has consequences that follow from it, some of which lead to a reduction of stress and strain, but some of which may increase stress and strain. Again, whether the family is able to remain resourceful in its efforts to activate and acquire and utilize resources, whether the family can modify its functioning in the situation and modify its perception and how it interprets what's happening, getting again to the family mindset, if you will, the perceptual field of the family, and then the various ways of responding that lead to effective adaptation or not. McCubbin and Patterson again talk about the positive end of the continuum of adaptation. They call it bond adaptation. And I've underlined the salient point: the maintenance or strengthening of family integrity. By that, they mean connectedness and contact, the continued promotion of family member development and family unit development, and the maintenance of family independence and its sense of control over environmental influences. Maladaptation, the other end of that continuum is a deterioration of family integrity, the breakdown of relationships, a curtailment or deterioration in personal health and development of a family member or of the unit, and the loss or decline in family independence and autonomy. Finally, a more recent modification of the model that began with Hill was put out by Figley and Kaiser with regard to families experiencing severe trauma. I won't spend a lot of time going over this, but if you look at it, it is a much more sophisticated presentation of the ABCX model. But I would draw your attention to the role that they assign to how the family is perceiving the situation and how the family is responding to the situation and how it is utilizing resources. So that led me, along with many other things, to propose, as many of you know, a dimensional model for trying to think about how families are functioning. There are 5 dimensions on it. I won't spend a lot of time going over each one of these. I've written about this, I've talked about this other times. But each of these dimensions is connected to every other one, so that it's possible for someone within a family to think about where he or she is along these dimensions, where the family unit is along these dimensions, and through the effort to work on self along a particular dimension to influence all the other dimensions within self, and through the effort in managing self, influence the family systems functioning along the same dimensions. So let me finish the talk there. I thought I'd finish it with these photos of bridges. If you'll put your attention on the central one, this is the very famous Shinkyo Bridge in Nikko, Japan, UNESCO World Heritage Site. Nikko is the site of 3 ancient shrines, 2 Shinto and 1 Buddhist. And I put this here in part simply to emphasize that we've known about the importance of families only forever, and highlight the fact that within the Shinto religion, the first of the 4 major affirmations of Shintoism focus on the importance of the human family unit to survival and reproduction. So thank you for your time and your attention. Let me now shift out of the sharing of my screen, and we can go to see whatever you want to have to say. I believe, yes, there's going to be a poll being set up for you to respond to if you want, so that the center can keep track of some of the information that people have. We're going to try to use the hand raising function, which requires you to raise your hand. The hand raise is actually in my computer in the reactions section at the bottom of the screen. For some of you, it may be in the participants list, depending upon which version of Zoom you have. So at the bottom of your screen, you may see a box that says reactions. If you click on it, you will see something that says raise hand. You click on that. If you don't have the reactions box, then if you click on participants, you will get a list of participants. And at the very bottom, At the right-hand side, you will see a feature that says raise your hand. And so we will go from there and see there is a hand raised.
It's Jerry D. Bowie.
Yes, if you'll go ahead and unmute yourself, go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Papero. This is a very great presentation you're doing, so I appreciate you. I have several questions, but I haven't formulated it in my head yet. But one question that I do have, and I've kind of thought about it as you was going through your presentation, is the implications of African Americans as a result of slavery and the disconnection of family. Is there any work or any thought that you have that by this disconnection, by people being kidnapped, brought overseas, brought here to America, work this system, is there an implication of that break off, like you said, the bridge to family, that can have on future thought processes and success for that family cohort? So I'm just going to mute myself and let you try to answer that as best as
You know, that's a very important question. And I won't pretend that I have research knowledge to say on that. What I believe is that it is important. A colleague of mine at the Bowen Center, Mignonette Keller, is descended from African Americans who were enslaved and has done a study of her families and made contact and has suggested in ways that has been important. I would say that I believe within the context of slavery, there were variations within African American families, even under those contexts, that some functioned more effectively and efficiently in maintaining contact and problem solving and adaptation than others did. And that those differences are probably visible today. That's what I believe. Could I prove that? By if I could get a large enough number of African American families and I could track that down, we could probably prove that. But I'm sorry, I can't do that. Maybe Dr. Keller has, and you might want to contact her. I believe you can contact her through the Bowen Center. You can find her contact information there. Anybody else? Don't see any more. Yeah, you're welcome.
Excuse me, I'm a little curious what you think will be the outcome of so many young adults having to return to their family of origin households and some of that differentiation or evolution being a little curtailed or cut off. I'm wondering what you see may be the future implications, or conversely, did it help them weather it all and so it's all good?
I think what we'll see is, again, the inevitable variation that reflect the competence of the family system at any given point in time. Some families will do very well with that. Some will muddle through. For some, it will be very, very difficult, and it will produce more strain and more distance ultimately. I think that is in the nature of things. I don't think you can take a one size fits all and put it on this. I think one can see that as one looks. Some families have found actually the effort to function through the various challenges of the era strengthening. Others have found it not so good. And if you follow those back in time, you will see the effects of history and the current levels of functioning of people influencing those things. It is the hand of cards we get. And then the question is, do we play it well or do we play it poorly?
Yes, I have a question, Dr. Papero.
Yeah, I can't see who's talking. So if you would
I'm
put
Harold
your hands
Lockett.
up.
Harold Lockett.
Okay, Mr. Lockett, I see you up in the corner there now. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Yelena was actually first. There's an order. Yelena.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine.
Yansky.
Okay, I'm seeing it now. I'm sorry. I'm supposed to be tracking that, Mr. Lockett. We'll get to you. I see you down there. All right. Let's go first to Ms. Smolyansky.
Hi, Dr. Papero. I'm a new clinician and I'm still working on being able to effectively formulate my questions. But the question that I had is, how do you feel cultural expectations affect the differentiation? as in some cultures expect more physical proximity, more communication, more sharing of information, whereas other cultures are a little more distinct for young folks that begin to really get into the process of differentiation. And if you would have any suggestions on how to mitigate that conversation for parents and children who have different cultural expectations.
Well, you know, that's a question that comes up frequently, and I never have a very good answer for it. Differentiation appears to be something that's universal across the world. I often hear the question, well, Asian families are more, having a senior moment here, I can't pick up the word I want, are more collectively oriented versus Western families are more, quotes, individualistic. And yet the idea of differentiation seems to make good sense to Asian families, that within there is variation in competent functioning. And there is flexibility within that, and there is room for people to be who they are in the family. Yes, there are variations in culture, certainly. But I think the basic stuff underneath it is pretty similar. A lot of work has gone on over the years to try to get clinicians to be culturally sensitive. And the problem is there's so many darn cultures in the world that you can't ever get good at all of them. It's hard to get good enough at your own culture, let alone somebody else's culture. I mean, just look at the difficulty we have here in the United States between non-African Americans talking to African Americans. There are cultural differences that make it hard to talk back and forth sometimes. But underneath that is this basic concern for the welfare of individuals, the welfare of the family, a future for children, and those things become a common basis, in my view, around which anybody can talk. They're important, they're there, they are at the very root of life itself, and it makes many of these cultural things, if a person engages respectfully with another about these things, less significant, at least knowing, quotes, the culture of an Italian family or whatever it is. That's kind of what I'd say. It's probably not much help to you, but it's the best I can do tonight.
No, it's actually great, but thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Okay, I see Ron Richardson there, and then Mr. Lockett.
So are you hearing me now?
I am.
Great. Dan, thank you so much for a thoughtful, helpful, provocative presentation. And I'm sure your ideas fit for a lot of us in our family experience. My question has to do with my family is an extinguishing family. My wife and I chose to have no children. The only other person in my generation, a cousin, never got married or had children. My biological father, whom I never knew, married again after he and my mother divorced, but I know through a contact with his lawyer that he never had children. And so we are a family that is extinguishing, and we're significantly cut off. Only through my efforts of the encounter with Dr. Bowen and working, knowing that I had needed to work at it first for myself, for my marriage, with my clients, I was able to overcome a fair amount of cutoff and become more of a resource in my family in the aging process with 4 family members, which I probably couldn't have done if I hadn't done this work, and I'm so grateful for that. But the question is, you know, my wife and I, we chose not to have children. We did 2 very rational, processes of decision-making about whether we would or not. And both times we said, no, we wouldn't. And then we read Toman, who said, when two only children marry each other, they often decide to not have children. So there went the rational part of it. But anyway, I mean, it's a phenomenon that I'm a part of, and I don't know how often you encountered or have had any thoughts about it, but
Many
that's
years
me.
ago, a faculty member at the Bowen Center, Dr. Roberta Holt, got interested in what she called families of extinction. And she talked about something she called the bloom before extinction, that the generation prior to extinction tended to do extremely well, kind of were often well-recognized figures, very successful figures. I know Ms. Harrison has studied reproduction and the effects of family functioning on reproduction over the years, and I'm sure she might have a lot more to say about this than I do. I do believe that there are lots of broad processes at work that affect reproduction that we don't think about much at all, that we're often unaware of. They can be within the family, they can be outside of the family. For example, on a global level, we know that female fertility has decreased significantly over the last several years, measured in the number of children per female on the globe. Within the last 30 or 40 years, it's decreased from an average of about 6 children per female to somewhere around 2 or under 2. I don't think we have any idea what's producing that. So there are these big factors as well that get into this. So Ron, damn it, I wish somebody would study your family. But in addition to you, I mean, I know you studied it. I mean, we need to know more about these things. I know, again, I want to come back to highlight Ms. Harrison, because I know she's thought a lot about this and looked at her own family across multiple generations and looks at the variation in reproductive patterning. And I'm sure she might have more to say about that than I would. Do you have anything more you want to say about it?
No, thank you. I appreciate those comments, and I will look at her work.
Okay, Mr. Lockett, you're up.
Yes, Dr. Papero, thank you very much for your
It's a funny name. I answer to anything.
Papero, right?
It's Papero.
Papero, okay, thank you.
But it's often called pepperoni.
Oh, okay. Well, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't do that to you. I was curious about your presentation, particularly about the ABC model that you talked about, and the adaptation, the further adaptation of the ABC model. I was thinking, what in your estimation, what do you think the impact of this COVID epidemic this pandemic experience, that COVID pandemic experience that all of us been going through, what impact do you think that will have upon how families make some adjustments moving forward? And do you think that will impact some families more than others? I'm sure it will. But how well they will adapt and not adapt, and so forth and so on. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and I think we have to wait and see. I think again, as I said earlier, I think families will vary. It depends partly upon the effect of COVID. We have 400,000 deaths here in the United States and growing. I assume may not be 400,000 families because there have been more than one death, but certainly hundreds of thousands of families are going to literally be faced with the death of a family member. And that has the potential to have an effect over time. Others will find that something about the associations created through COVID have been helpful to the family unit. Others will find it not so. Some family units within this, when hit with the COVID situation, have discovered that the lack of relationships, the failure to tend relationships, if you will, within the family has led to them being more isolated and more resource deprived, creating more problems over time. It's a great question. If I were an academic researcher, I would start right now trying to track longitudinally what's happening to families as we go forward from this time forward. because I think we'll see a great range of variation. Some families will come out with greater resiliency, others with less. Many will come out about where they started. Again, it depends where you are, what your resource base is, where you sit in the world. All of these variables get in there, plus the level of maturity, this ability to use the thinking brain to manage self and to stay in contact and to think forward in time, and not just be in this automatic response. And then the ability to rein in the fearfulness. We live in a world of conspiracy theories, which are driven by fear primarily. And they're driven by a fearfulness that is out of contact with objective reality. And when people can rein that fearfulness in, they do a better job of adapting to reality. They see the problem more clearly. They can think better about what to do. They are not engaged in a fantasy world. It's not necessarily a bad thing to have a fantasy occasionally about things, but when your life is being governed by something that has no significant contact with objective reality, there's a big problem coming.
You know, and if I may just add this to that, this unresolved grief that families have experienced so far definitely may have an impact upon this cutoffs and distant from grieving and how they move forward with, you know, developing more meaningful contacts with in the future. You know, for those who are left behind. So
It's, you know, some families, the inability to be present around a failing older member of a family, that's happened to many families. In other words, the person is in a care facility of some sort and the family can't visit, or the person is literally in a COVID unit with struggling with the illness and the family can't visit. Some families will use that experience and come out with better connectedness and a greater understanding of how to respond to problems. Others will splinter, others will muddle through, and we're seeing that. All you got to do is pick up and read the responses that you're seeing in the news about various family responses to this. The news is filled with it right now. And again, it's this variation where the family, how well the family is functioning before has an effect on how well it's handling, it has an effect on what happens. And my point in it is that no matter where the family is functioning, the idea that Murray Bowen provides about the effort to work on self, to manage self in accordance with the principles that he lines out connected with differentiation of self, has within it the capacity for an individual both to function up him or herself and in functioning up influence the functioning of the family unit, which increases its adaptive flexibility over time. And as that family unit functions better, it has the capacity to influence the larger social systems of which it's a part. This isn't a part I put into this talk, but it's something I think is probably very accurate. I can cite some evidence for it. But family unit functioning affects social functioning. When family units are functioning up, they pressure the societies around them to function up. Now, it can work the other way as well, and we see that in our current state, that the society influences the family and the family functioning deteriorates. But when following the ideas that Bowen laid out around differentiation of self, there is a way for people to work on this. It isn't just collapse into helplessness. There is a way to work on this. Anyway, you know, there I am preaching. I said to myself I wouldn't do this tonight, but I did. Let me see who's up next. Let me look over here. Don, I don't see a last name, Don. I'm sorry.
Okay, can you hear me, Doctor?
Yep, I can.
Okay, thanks for taking my question. I've written it down here, so bear with me. Have you ever come across families that are extremely cut off due to the multi-generational transmission of trauma? And in my case, what I've been researching through a genogram is I believe I found it to be sex abuse / incest. Can you shed any light on that? How, can you give me anything to, any hope, I guess? I can give you some of the patterns that I've found maybe, and you can maybe comment on those.
Well, it's probably more than we probably should put into this. I don't want to put your personal information out into the audience tonight.
Oh, okay. There's no problem. No problem.
I can tell you as a general thing that yes, I and almost anybody who's worked with a family systems viewpoint has run into these deep cutoffs, which follow the some sort of extreme stress and adversity within the family system itself. Sex abuse is, of course, one of them, but
Yeah.
violence, all of these sorts of things. And there is a tendency for families to splinter or for cutoffs to happen. And
is there any hope for it? I mean,
yeah, I wouldn't
go
get into the word hope because I wouldn't necessarily define that cutoff under those circumstances as a bad move. It is a survival move that somebody makes under those circumstances. It solves the problem in the short run, but it creates a bigger problem in the long run.
Yeah.
I think that it is possible for people to work on these things, to work on these deep cutoffs. It's not easy. It's not Pollyanna. It's not we're all going to sit around the fire and sing Kumbaya. But it is possible for an individual to work on these things, and in so doing, begin to pick up his or her own functioning following traumatic events and circumstances, and potentially influence the functioning of the family unit. But it's slow, it's hard work.
Yeah, I think what's happened, I can add this if I have a second.
Sure.
What happened, this happened probably 4 generations back, and the person that was affected reenacted some things to kind of deal with it, which caused even more problems. And what she reenacted was denying paternity in a lot of cases. So you've got a problem on top of a problem, and so that's hidden, and it's really a hornet's nest almost.
All I can say to you is that I have seen people work on this who have come out of very extreme family situations and have made progress on it in terms of their own life and in terms of the future of their families.
Mm-hmm.
And at times have gained something that's been a benefit even to if for example, the people involved in the actual event or set of events is still alive, to make some sort of contact and the value there. It's not, there's no pill for it. It's just a heck of a lot of hard work and somebody's motivation to work on it. They just are saying, I'm not going under with this. I'm going to figure out what to do here.
To get people to go along with you. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate your insight.
Yep. M. Cook is up next.
Yes, good evening. Thanks. Thank you so much for your presentation. I recently read your book again, your first book, and find to be very helpful. So thank you. First, I just had one question in terms of, and it's pretty much like it kind of connects to what the gentleman was saying in the last conversation. I was curious about how do you work on a one-on-one relationship and an effort to build your own differentiation of self, your own, to kind of spike up your own level of differentiation of self when you have to return to family members who perpetuated violence against an individual. So I'm just thinking in terms of like strategies would be in some way writing letters, making a phone call. How do you begin to kind of suggest that someone might do that if they have the motivation to want to build a one-on-one?
The initial step is for a person even to consider the idea that they might have contact with that situation. Usually the cutoff is so deep the person can't even imagine contact with it. And then there's the question of safety. Which is what happens. People are fearful, and rightly so, in a certain sense, because bad things have happened. Then the person has to think through, if I have contact with this family, how do I be responsible for my own safety? Because you can't count on anybody else to do it. Then you have to think about, how am I going to do that? And figure out, maybe you write letters, sure. Maybe you agree to, meet in a public place. I don't know, each individual has to think that through. And then you begin in small steps, trying it out. And usually the first experiments don't work very well. And you got to keep going. If you're going to start to climb Mount Everest and you get to the first foothill and you say, "Oh, I'm tired," and give up, well, you ain't going to get to the top of Everest. So I don't know. It's a great question. All I can tell you is I have seen people work on this and make significant progress on it.
Yeah, I like what you're saying in terms of the particularly a person having the motivation even to consider. That's a step in terms of maturing oneself a bit. So
Right.
in my opinion, so I appreciate that. So that might be the extent of it. But who knows?
Well, I could give you a big technical answer. There's lots that Bowen theory would have to say about how you might work on that. There's probably not enough time here to do any of that, but at some other point, maybe you can come to another meeting or contact someone within the Bowen network who can talk with you more about it. I think we have a few more minutes left. Oh gosh, I'm not going to know how to say your last name. Rajnik? Jennifer Rajnik?
Yeah, I related to your comment of no one's ever pronounced it correctly since the day I got married. So
How do you pronounce it?
it's Rainick. Like
Rainick. Oh, of course. The J is an I.
Yeah. Why? So I'm just curious. I'm new to Bowen theory. We're doing it as part of our CPE training. And as a mom, I'm very curious, especially a mom of teenagers who are strongly in this, differentiation of self kind of growth process. What are some of the practical tips of what to do well? And as we learn ourselves, maybe what we've done poorly, how do we go back and revisit that and dialogue with our kids about what we wanted, but were unable to perhaps provide at different parts of their development?
Oh gosh, what a question. We could spend hours on that one as well. Murray Bowen was once asked if he could define effective parenting in 2 words. Yeah, go figure. And we recall differently what he said. We have 2 versions of it. One, he talked about non-anxious interest, and the other was non-anxious investment. I don't think there's such a thing as a mistake in parenting that can't be worked on and done better. Bowen used to talk about there's nothing created in a relationship that can't be repaired in a relationship. I think one of the things has to do with parents understanding that you're not going to get everything right. And development is not totally up to you. The kid plays a part in development as well. as does the context of the larger family, as does the context in which the family and the child are embedded. Most kids come out all right. We look at ourselves and we perceive our flaws, but mostly we do okay in the world, more or less. Anyway, it's a big question. There's lots that could be said about it. How do you think alongside your child as opposed to get in your child's? How do you avoid interfering in your child's effort to learn problem-solving functioning? Lots been said about that over the years. I can't do better than that tonight. Sorry.
Are there authors that you could lead us to that have focused more on Bowen theory and parenting?
Roberta Gilbert has written some stuff about that. Jenny Brown, Michael Kerr has written some things about that. Many have. If you go in and track it in the literature, you'll find some stuff about that. I think it's time for us to quit, Ann. I see your hand is up. Is that right?
Yes, but I'd like to close. All right, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. I'd like to close up the evening, and I really want to thank you, Dan, very much for your just for everything you put into these evenings, it generates lots of questions. One universal thought is that the clinical conference that often follows these meetings offers opportunities for people to listen in and hear how some people have done their own family work. And that is very valuable when you're trying to get a concept in mind and trying to find ways to just open up your mind a little bit. So these clinical conferences held on, like tomorrow is one with Barbara Lehman, who is Dr. Lehman, who is a faculty member at the Bowen Center, and she's doing one on the systems model for family assessment and clinical practice. People can sign up for that. Those do cost. There is a fee involved, but you can go online and get that information. Next month is the Faith and Leadership Conference on Friday, but I have engaged Dr. Eben Alexander on Thursday evening for the Thursday program like tonight, which is free. He is a physician and a neurologist. He had a near-death experience, and I am not focused particularly on near-death experiences, but he had, being a scientist at the same time, and he had a significant medical challenge that it raises some questions for me about how to understand Dr. Bowen's 9th concept, which has not been well defined yet. So if anybody is interested in that, we'd love to have you. It will be at 7:30 on Thursday, February the 11th. Thank you very much for your participation tonight, and please join us again.